Indeed, within an hour the wounded man had rallied from his swoon and the fever had diminished. But the sailor's first care, on recovering memory and speech, was to ask for Lord Glenarvan, or, in his absence, the Major MacNab, seeing him so feeble, would have forbidden all conversation, but Mulrady insisted with such energy that he was forced to yield. The interview had already lasted some time, and they were only waiting for the Major's report. Soon the curtains of the cart moved and he appeared. He joined his friends at the foot of a gum tree. His face, usually so calm, betokened a serious anxiety. When his eyes encountered Lady Helena and the young girl, they expressed a deep sadness. Glenarvan questioned him and learned what the sailor had related. On leaving the encampment, Mulrady had followed one of the paths indicated by Paganel. He hastened, as much at least as the darkness of the night permitted him. According to his estimate, he had traveled a distance of about 2 miles, when several men, 5 he thought, sprang to his horse's head. The animal reared. Mulrady seized his revolver and fired. He thought that 2 of his assailants fell. By the flash of the report he recognized Ben Joyce, but that was all. He had not time to fully discharge his weapon. A violent blow was struck upon his right side which brought him to the ground. However, he had not yet lost consciousness. The assassins believed him dead. He felt them search him, then a conversation ensued. "I have the letter," said one of them. "Give it to me," replied Ben Joyce, "and now the Duncan is ours." At this point in the story, Glenarvan could not restrain a cry. MacNab continued. "A hopeless chance." "Now, you others," said Ben Joyce, "catch the horse. In 2 days I shall be on board the Duncan, and in 6 at Twofold Bay. There is the place of meeting. The Lord's party will be still fast in the marshes of the Snowy. Cross the river at Kemple Pier Bridge, go to the coast, and wait for me. I will find means to bring you on board. With the crew once at sea and a vessel like the Duncan, we shall be masters of the Indian Ocean." "Hurrah for Ben Joyce!" cried the convicts. Mulrady's horse was then led up, and Ben Joyce disappeared at a gallop on the Lucknow road, while the band proceeded southeastward to the Snowy River. Mulrady, although severely wounded, had strength to drag himself within 200 paces of the encampment, where we picked him up almost dead. "This," added MacNab, "is Mulrady's sad story. You understand now why the courageous sailor wished so much to speak." This revelation terrified all. "Pirates, pirates," cried Glenarvan. "My crew massacred, my Duncan in the hands of these bandits." "Yes, for Ben Joyce will surprise the vessel," replied the Major, "and then—" "Well, we must reach the coast before these wretches," said Paganel. "But how cross the Snowy?" asked Wilson. "Like them," answered Glenarvan. "They will cross Kemple Pier Bridge, and we will do the same." "But what will become of Mulrady?" inquired Lady Helena. "We will take turns in carrying him. Shall I give up my defenseless crew to Ben Joyce's band?" The plan of crossing Kemple Pier Bridge was practicable, but perilous. The convicts might locate themselves at this point to defend it. It would be at least 30 against 7. But there are moments when we do not think of these things, when we must advance at all hazards. "My lord," said Captain Mangles at length, "before risking our last chance, before venturing towards the bridge, it is prudent to reconnoiter it first. I will undertake this." "I will accompany you, Captain," replied Paganel. The animal reared. Mulrady seized his revolver and fired. The burned bridge. This proposal was accepted, and the captain and Paganel prepared to start immediately. They were to follow along the bank of the river till they came to the place indicated by Ben Joyce, and keep out of sight of the convicts, who were probably lying in wait. These 2 courageous men accordingly, well furnished with arms and provisions, set out, and soon disappeared among the tall rushes of the river. All day the little party waited for them. At evening they had not yet returned, and great fears were entertained. At last, about 11 o'clock, Wilson announced their approach. They arrived, worn out with the fatigues of a 6-mile journey. "The bridge, is it there?" asked Glenarvan, rushing to meet them. "Yes, a bridge of rushes," said Captain Mangles. "The convicts passed, it is true, but—" "But what?" cried Glenarvan, who foresaw a new calamity. "They burned it after their passage," replied Paganel. Chapter 43. Helpless and hopeless. It was not the time to despair but to act. If Kemple Pier Bridge was destroyed, they must cross the Snowy at all events, and reach Twofold Bay before Ben Joyce's band. They lost no time, therefore, in vain words, But the next day Captain Mangles and Glenarvan went to examine the river, preparatory to a passage. The tumultuous waters, swollen by the rains, had not subsided. They whirled along with indescribable fury. It was certain death to brave this torrent. Glenarvan, with folded arms and lowered head, stood motionless. "Do you wish me to try to swim to the opposite bank?" asked Captain Mangles. "No, John," replied Glenarvan, seizing the bold young man by the hand. "Let us wait." They both returned to the encampment. The day was passed in the most lively anxiety. 10 times did Glenarvan return to the river. He sought to contrive some bold plan of crossing it, but in vain. It would not have been more impassable if a torrent of lava had flowed between its banks. During these long hours of delay, Lady Helena, with the Major's assistance, bestowed upon Mulrady the most skillful care. The sailor felt that he was returning to life. MacNab ventured to affirm that no vital organ had been injured. The loss of blood sufficiently explained the patient's weakness. Thus, as soon as his wound was healed and the hemorrhage stopped, only time and rest were needed for his complete restoration. Lady Helena had insisted upon his occupying her end of the cart. Mulrady felt greatly honored. His greatest anxiety was in the thought that his condition might delay Glenarvan, and he forced them to promise that they would leave him at the camp in charge of Wilson as soon as the river became fordable. Unfortunately, this was not possible, either that day or the next. At seeing himself thus detained, Glenarvan despaired. Lady Helena and the Major tried in vain to pacify and exhort him to patience. Patience! When, at that moment perhaps, Ben Joyce was going on board the yacht, when the Duncan was weighing anchor and steaming towards that fatal coast, to which every hour brought her nearer. Almost despairing, Captain Mangles felt at heart all Glenarvan's anguish, and as he wished to overcome the difficulty at all hazards, he constructed a canoe in the Australian fashion, with large pieces of the bark of the gum trees. These slabs, which were very light, were held together by wooden crossbars and formed a very frail craft. The captain and the sailor tried the canoe. All that skill, strength, or courage could do they did, but scarcely were they in the current, when they capsized and narrowly escaped with their lives. The boat was drawn into the eddies and disappeared. Captain Mangles and Wilson had not advanced 10 yards into the river, which was swollen by the rains and melting snows, till it was now a mile in breadth. 2 days were wasted in this way. The Major and Glenarvan went 5 miles upstream without finding a practicable ford. Everywhere was the same impetuosity, the same tumultuous rush of water. All the southern slopes of the mountains had poured their liquid torrents into the single stream. They were forced, therefore, to give up any hope of saving the Duncan. 5 days had passed since Ben Joyce's departure. The yacht was probably that very moment at the coast, in the hands of the convicts. However, this state of things could not last long. Indeed, on the morning of the 3rd day, Paganel perceived that the waters were beginning to subside. He reported to Glenarvan the result of his observations. "What does it matter now?" replied Glenarvan. "It is too late." "That is no reason for prolonging our stay at the encampment," replied the Major. "Certainly not," said Captain Mangles. "Tomorrow perhaps it will be possible to cross." "But will that save my unfortunate crew?" cried Glenarvan. "Listen to me, my lord," continued Captain Mangles. "I know Tom Austin. He was to execute your orders and start as soon as his departure was possible. Who knows whether the Duncan was ready or her injuries repaired on the arrival of Ben Joyce at Melbourne, supposing the yacht could not put to sea, and suffered 1 or 2 days of delay." "You are right, John," replied Glenarvan. "We must reach Twofold Bay. We are only 35 miles from Delegate." "Yes," said Paganel, "and in that town we shall find rapid means of conveyance. Who knows whether we shall not arrive in time to prevent this calamity?" "Let us start," cried Glenarvan. Captain Mangles and Wilson at once occupied themselves in constructing a raft of large dimensions. Experience had proved that pieces of bark could not resist the violence of the torrent. The captain cut down several gum trees, of which he made a rude but substantial raft. It was a tedious task, and that day ended before the work was completed, but the next day it was finished. The waters had now considerably subsided. The torrent had become a river again, with a rapid current. However, with proper management, the captain hoped to reach the opposite bank. At noon they put on board as much provisions as each could carry for 2 days' travel. The rest was abandoned with the cart and the tent. Mulready was well enough to be moved. He was recovering rapidly. Each took his place on the raft, which was moored to the bank. Captain Mangles had arranged on the starboard side and confided to Wilson a kind of oar to sustain the raft against the current and prevent its drifting. As for himself, he stood at the stern and steered by means of a clumsy rudder. Lady Helena and Mary Grant occupied the center of the raft near Mulready. Glenarvan, the Major, Paganel, and Robert surrounded them, ready to lend assistance. "Are we ready, Wilson?" asked Captain Mangles. "Yes, Captain," replied the sailor, seizing his oar with a firm hand. However, the raft was entangled in the midst of the river, half a mile below where they started. "Attention, and bear up against the current." Captain Mangles unmoored the raft, and with one push launched it into the current of the river. All went well for some time, and Wilson resisted the leeway. But soon the craft was drawn into the eddies, and turned round and round, so that neither oar nor rudder could keep it in a straight course. In spite of their efforts, they were soon placed in a position where it was impossible to use the oars. They were forced to be passive. There was no means of preventing this gyratory motion. They were whirled about with a giddy rapidity and sent out of their course. The captain, with pale face and set teeth, stood and gazed at the eddying water. However, the raft was entangled in the midst of the river, half a mile below where they started. The current here was very strong, and as it broke the eddies, it lessened the whirling motion. The captain and Wilson resumed their oars and succeeded in propelling the craft in an oblique direction. In this way they approached nearer the left bank, and were only a few yards distant when Wilson's oar broke. The raft, no longer sustained against the current, was carried downstream. The captain endeavored to prevent it, at the risk of breaking his rudder, and Wilson with bleeding hands assisted him. At last they succeeded, and the raft, after a voyage of more than half an hour, ran upon the steeply sloping bank. The shock was violent, the timbers were thrown apart, the ropes broken, and the foaming water came through. The travelers had only time to cling to the bushes that hung over the stream. They extricated Mulready and the two ladies, who were half drenched. In short, everybody was saved, but the greater part of the provisions and arms, except the Major's rifle, were swept away with the fragments of the raft. A weary pilgrimage. The river was crossed, but the little party were without resources, 35 miles from Delegate, in the midst of these untrodden deserts. They resolved to start without delay. Mulready saw that he would cause trouble and desired to remain behind, even alone, and wait for aid from Delegate. But Glenarvan refused. He could not reach the town before 3 days. If the Duncan had left Melbourne several days before, what mattered a delay of a few hours? "No, my friend," said he, "I will not abandon anyone. We will make a litter and take turns in carrying you." The litter was made of branches covered with leaves, and upon this Mulready was placed. Glenarvan wished to be the first to bear the sailor, and, seizing one end of the litter and Wilson the other, they started. What a sad sight, and how disastrously this journey, so well begun, had ended. They were no longer going in search of Captain Grant. This continent, where he was not, nor had ever been, threatened to be fatal to those who were seeking traces of him, and perhaps new discouragements still awaited them. The first day passed silently and painfully. Every 10 minutes they took turns in carrying the litter. All the sailors' companions uncomplainingly imposed upon themselves this duty, which was made still more arduous by the great heat. At evening, after accomplishing only 5 miles, they encamped under a group of gum trees. The rest of the provisions that had escaped the shipwreck furnished the evening meal. They must hereafter rely on the Major's rifle, but he found no opportunity to fire a single shot. Fortunately, Robert found a nest of bustards, containing a dozen large eggs, which Albinett cooked in the hot ashes. In addition to these embarrassments, their way became very difficult. The sandy plains were bristling with thorny plants that tore their garments and lacerated their limbs. The courageous ladies, however, did not complain, but valiantly advanced, setting the example and encouraging each other by a word or a look. On the 3rd day Mulready traveled part of the way on foot. His wound had entirely healed. The town of Delegate was only 10 miles distant, and at evening they encamped on the very frontiers of New South Wales. A fine and penetrating rain had been falling for several hours, and all shelter would have failed if Captain Mangles had not fortunately discovered a ruined and abandoned sawyer's hut. They were obliged to content themselves with this miserable hovel of branches and thatch. Wilson attempted to kindle a fire to prepare the food, and accordingly collected some dead wood that strewed the ground. But when he attempted to light the fuel, he did not succeed. The great quantity of a luminous material that it contained prevented combustion. It was, therefore, necessary to dispense with fire and food, and sleep in wet garments, while the birds, hidden in the lofty branches, seemed to mock these unfortunate travelers. However, Glenarvan and his friends were approaching the end of their sufferings, and it was time. The two ladies exerted themselves heroically, but their strength was failing every hour. They dragged themselves along, they no longer walked. The next day they started at daybreak, and at 11 o'clock Delegate came in sight, 50 miles from Twofold Bay. Here means of conveyance were quickly obtained. Feeling himself so near the coast, hope returned to Glenarvan's heart. Perhaps there had been some slight delay, and he would arrive before the Duncan. In 24 hours he would reach the bay. At noon, after a comforting repast, all the travelers took their seats in a mail coach, and left Delegate at the full speed of 5 strong horses. The postilions, stimulated by the promise of a large reward, drove them along at a rapid rate, over a well-kept road. No time was lost in changing horses, and it seemed as if Glenarvan had inspired all with his own intense eagerness. The two ladies exerted themselves heroically, but their strength was failing every hour. They dragged themselves along, they no longer walked. All day and all night they traveled with the same swiftness, and at sunrise the next morning a low murmur announced the proximity of the Indian Ocean. It was necessary, however, to pass around the bay to gain that part of the coast where Tom Austin was to meet the travelers. When the sea appeared, all eyes quickly surveyed the wide expanse. Was the Duncan there, by a miracle of Providence, as she had been discerned before by some of them on the Argentine coast? Nothing was seen. Sky and water mingled in an unbroken horizon. Not a sail brightened the vast extent of ocean. One hope still remained. Perhaps Tom Austin had thought it best to cast anchor in Twofold Bay, as the sea was rough and a vessel could not be moored in safety near such shores. "To Eden," said Glenarvan. The mail coach at once took the road to the right, which ran along the edge of the bay, and proceeded towards the little town of Eden, only 5 miles distant. The postilions stopped not far from the light that guarded the entrance to the harbor. Several ships were anchored in the roadstead, but none displayed the flag of Malcolm Castle. Glenarvan, Captain Mangles, and Paganel alighted immediately and hastened to the custom house. Here they questioned the employees and consulted the latest arrivals. No vessel had entered the bay for a week. "She may not have started," cried Glenarvan, who would not despair. "Perhaps we have arrived before her." Captain Mangles shook his head. He knew Tom Austin. His mate would never have delayed so long to execute an order. "I will know what this means," said Glenarvan. "Certainty is better than doubt." The last hope. 15 minutes later, a telegram was sent to the shipbrokers of Melbourne, and the travelers repaired to the Victoria Hotel. Not long after an answer was delivered to Lord Glenarvan. It read as follows: Lord Glenarvan, Eden, Twofold Bay. Duncan started on the 18th instant for some unknown destination. The dispatch fell from Glenarvan's hands. There was no more doubt. The honest Scotch yacht in Ben Joyce's hands had become a pirate vessel. Thus ended their search in Australia, begun under such favorable auspices. The traces of Captain Grant and his shipwrecked sailors seemed irrecoverably lost. This failure had cost the lives of an entire crew. Lord Glenarvan was crushed by the blow, and this courageous searcher, whom the leagued elements had failed to deter, was now baffled by the malice of men. Chapter 44. A rough captain. If ever the searchers for Captain Grant had reason to despair of seeing him again, was it not when every hope forsook them at once? To what part of the world should they venture a new expedition? How explore unknown countries? The Duncan was no longer in their possession, and they could not be immediately reconciled to their misfortune. The undertaking of these generous Scots had, therefore, failed. Failure. Sad word, that finds no echo in a valiant soul. And yet, amid all the changes of destiny, Glenarvan was forced to acknowledge his powerlessness to pursue this work of mercy. Mary Grant, in this situation, no longer had the courage to utter the name of her father. She suppressed her own anguish by thinking of the unfortunate crew. Controlling herself in the presence of her friend, it was she who consoled Lady Helena, from whom she had received so many consolations. The young girl was the first to speak of their return to Scotland. At seeing her so courageous and resigned, Captain Mangles admired her, and would have spoken a final word in favor of Captain Grant, if Mary had not stopped him with a look and then said, "No, Mr. John, let us think of those who have sacrificed themselves. Lord Glenarvan must return to England." "You are right, Miss Mary," replied he must. "The English authorities must also be informed of the fate of the Duncan, but do not give up all hope. The search that we have begun I would continue alone, rather than abandon. I will find Captain Grant or succumb to the task." This was a solemn compact which John Mangles thus made. Mary accepted it, and gave her hand to the young captain, as if to ratify this treaty. On the part of the latter it was a devotion of his entire life, on the part of the former an unchanging gratitude. The time of their departure was now definitely decided. They resolved to proceed to Melbourne without delay. The next day Captain Mangles went to inquire about vessels that were upon the point of sailing. He expected to find frequent communication between Eden and Melbourne, but he was disappointed. The vessels were few. 2 or 3 anchored in Twofold Bay composed the entire fleet of the place. There were none for Melbourne, Sydney, or Point Egala. In this state of affairs, what was to be done? Wait for a ship. They might be delayed a long time, for Twofold Bay is little frequented. After some deliberation, Glenarvan was about to decide upon reaching Sydney by the coast, when Paganel made a proposal that was unexpected to everyone. It was a brig of 250 tons, called the Macquarie, which traded between the different ports of Australia and New Zealand. The geographer had just returned from Twofold Bay. He knew that there were no means of transportation to Sydney or Melbourne, but of the 3 vessels anchored in the roadstead, one was preparing to start for Auckland, the capital of Ingenuity, the northern island of New Zealand. Thither Paganel proposed to go by the bark in question, and from Auckland it would be easy to return to England by the steamers of the English Company. This proposition was taken into serious consideration, although Paganel did not enter into those extended arguments of which he was usually so lavish. He confined himself to stating the fact, and added that the voyage would not last more than 5 or 6 days. Captain Mangles advocated Paganel's plan. He thought it should be adopted, since they could not wait for the uncertain arrival of other vessels. But before deciding, he judged it advisable to visit the ship in question. Accordingly, he, with Glenarvan, the Major, Paganel, and Robert, took a boat, and pulled out to where it was anchored. It was a brig of 250 tons, called the Macquarie, which traded between the different ports of Australia and New Zealand. The captain, or rather the master, received his visitors very gruffly. They saw that they had to deal with an uneducated man, whose manners were not different from those of the 5 sailors of his crew. A coarse red face, big hands, a flat nose, a blinded eye, lips blackened by his pipe, and especially brutish appearance, made Will Halley a very forbidding character. But they had no choice, and for a voyage of a few days there was no need to be very particular. "What do you want?" asked Will Halley, as the strangers reached the deck of his vessel. "The captain," replied Mangles. "A business interview." "I am he," said Halley. "What then?" "The Macquarie is loading for Auckland." "Yes, what of it?" "What does she carry?" "Anything that is bought or sold." "When does she sail?" "Tomorrow at the noontide." "Would she take passengers?" "That depends upon the passengers, and whether they would be satisfied with the ship's mess." "They would take their own provisions." "Wells, how many are there?" 9, 2 of them ladies." "I have no cabins." "We will arrange a place for their exclusive use." "What then?" "Do you accept?" asked Captain Mangles, who was not embarrassed by this curtness. "I must see," replied the master of the Macquarie. He took a turn or two, striking the deck with his heavy, hobnailed boots, then turning to Captain Mangles said, "What do you pay?" "What do you ask?" was the reply. £50. Glenarvan nodded assent. "Very well, £50. But the passage in cash," added Halley. "In cash." "Food separate." "Separate." "Agreed, well," said Will Halley, holding out his hand. "What?" "The advance money." "Here is half the fare, 25 pounds, said Captain Mangles, counting out the sum, which the master pocketed without saying thank you. "Be on board tomorrow," said he. "Whether you are here or not, I shall weigh anchor." "We will be here." Thereupon Glenarvan, the Major, Robert, Paganel, and Captain Mangles left the vessel, without Will Halley's having so much as touched the brim of his hat. "What a stupid fellow," was their first remark. "Well, I like him," replied Paganel. "He is a real sea-wolf." "A real bear," remarked the Major. "And I imagine," added Captain Mangles, "that this bear has at some time traded in human flesh." "What matter?" replied Glenarvan. "So long as he commands the Macquarie, which goes to New Zealand, we shall see very little of him on the voyage." Lady Helena and Mary Grant were very much pleased to know that they were to start the next day. Glenarvan observed, however, that the Macquarie could not equal the Duncan for comfort, but after so many hardships, they were not likely to be overcome by trifles. Mr. Albinett was requested to take charge of the provisions. The poor man, since the loss of the Duncan, had often lamented the unhappy fate of his wife, who had remained on board, and would be, consequently, the victim of the convicts' brutality. However, he fulfilled his duties as steward with his accustomed zeal, and their food might yet consist of dishes that were never seen on the ship's table. In the meantime, the Major discounted at a money-changer's some drafts that Glenarvan had on the Union Bank of Melbourne. As for Paganel, he procured an excellent map of New Zealand. Mulrady was now quite well. He scarcely felt his wound, which had so nearly proved fatal. A few hours at sea would complete his recovery. The landlord of Victoria Hotel furnished them with 2 horses, and they set out. Wilson went on board first, charged with arranging the passengers' quarters. Under his vigorous use of the brush and broom, the aspect of things was greatly changed. Will Halley shrugged his shoulders, but allowed the sailor to do as he pleased. As for Glenarvan and his friends, he scarcely noticed them. He did not even know their names, nor did he care to. This increase of cargo was worth 50 pounds to him, but he valued it less than the 200 tons of tanned leather with which his hold was crowded, the skins first and the passengers next. He was a real trader, and by his nautical ability he passed for a good navigator of these seas, rendered so very dangerous by the coral reefs. During the afternoon, Glenarvan wished to visit once more the supposed place of the shipwreck. Ayrton had certainly been the quartermaster of the Britannia, and the vessel might really have been lost on that part of the coast. And there, at all events, the Duncan had fallen into the hands of the convicts. Had there been a fight, perhaps they would find on the beach traces of a struggle. If the crew had perished in the waves, would not the bodies have been cast ashore? Glenarvan, accompanied by his faithful captain, undertook this examination. The landlord of Victoria Hotel furnished them with 2 horses and they set out. But it was a sad journey. They rode in silence. The same thoughts, the same anxieties tortured the mind of each. They gazed at the rocks worn by the sea. They had no need to question or answer. No sign of the Duncan could be found. The whole coast was bare. Captain Mangles, however, found on the margin of the shore evident signs of an encampment, the remains of fires recently kindled beneath the few trees. Had a wandering tribe of natives passed there within a few days? No, for an object struck Glenarvan's eye, which proved incontestably that the convicts had visited that part of the coast. The last night in Australia. It was a grey and yellow jacket, worn and patched, left at the foot of a tree. It bore a number and badge of the Perth Penitentiary. The convict was no longer there, but his cast-off garment betrayed him. "You see, John," said Glenarvan, "the convicts have been here, and our poor comrades of the Duncan." "Yes," replied the captain in a low voice, "they have certainly been landed and have perished." "The wretches," cried Glenarvan, "if they ever fall into my hands, I will avenge my crew." Grief and exposure had hardened Glenarvan's features. For several moments he gazed at the vast expanse of water, seeking perhaps to discern some ship in the dim distance. Then his eyes relaxed their fierceness, he regained his composure, and without adding a word or making a sign, took the road to Eden. Only one duty remained to be fulfilled, to inform the constable of the events that had just transpired, which was done the same evening. The magistrate, Thomas Banks, could scarcely conceal his satisfaction at making out the official record. He was simply delighted at the departure of Ben Joyce and his band. The whole village shared his joy. The convicts had left Australia because of a new crime, but at all events, they had gone. This important news was immediately telegraphed to the authorities of Melbourne and Sydney. Having accomplished his object, Glenarvan returned to the Victoria Hotel. The travelers passed this last evening in Australia in sadness. Their thoughts wandered over this country, so fertile in misfortunes. They recalled the hopes they had reasonably conceived at Cape Bernouilli, now so cruelly disappointed at Twofold Bay. Paganel was a prey to a feverish agitation. Captain Mangles, who had watched him since the incident at Snowy River, many times pressed him with questions which Paganel did not answer. But that evening, as he went with him to his chamber, the captain asked him why he was so nervous. "My friend," replied Paganel evasively, "I am no more nervous than usual." "Mr. Paganel, you have a secret that troubles you." "Well, as you will," cried the geographer, "it is stronger than I." "What is stronger than you?" "My joy on the one hand, and my despair on the other." "You are joyful and despairing at the same time." "Yes, joyful and despairing at visiting New Zealand." "Have you any news?" asked Captain Mangles. "Have you discovered the lost trail?" "No, friend, people never return from New Zealand. But yet, well, you know human nature. As long as we breathe we can hope, and my motto is Dum Spiro Sparrow, which is the best in the world. Chapter 45. The Wreck of the Macquarie. The next day the travelers were installed on board the Macquarie. Will Halley had not offered the ladies his cabin, which was not to be regretted, as the lair was only fit for the brute. At noon they made ready to take the flood tide. The anchor was weighed, a moderate breeze blew from the southwest. The sails were gradually set, but the 5 men worked slowly. At last, incited by the oaths of the skipper, they accomplished their task, but in spite of her spread of canvas the brig scarcely advanced. Yet, however poorly she sailed, in 5 or 6 days they hoped to reach the harbour of Auckland. At 7 o'clock in the evening they lost sight of the shores of Australia and the lighthouse at Eden. The sea was rough, and the vessel laboured heavily in the trough of the waves. The passengers found their situation very uncomfortable, but as they could not remain on deck, they were forced to submit to confinement. But on the next day 7 canoes of the islanders attacked it most violently and suddenly, causing it to capsize. That evening conversation very naturally turned upon the land to which they were now sailing, its discovery and colonization, and just as naturally all turned to Paganel as to a bookcase, for some information thereon. It was very readily accessible, although evidently to the geographer's mind, there was something of a painful character connected with the name, the impression, and the very thoughts of New Zealand and its Maori inhabitants. "Monsieur Paganel," said Lady Helena, "have your friends, the English, been the only ones to search out this island?" "By no means, madam," was the prompt reply. "On the contrary, they have come second, nay, third in the race, only," and he looked half roguishly and half maliciously, "they stayed when they came." And then he told them of its first discovery by Abel Tasman, the Dutch navigator, in 1642, that, when first he landed, there seemed to be amicable feelings expressed by the islanders toward himself, a number of them coming back to his ship, and being apparently well pleased to cultivate intercourse. But on the next day, as he sent his boat to find good anchorage nearer to the shore, 7 canoes of the islanders attacked it most violently and suddenly, causing it to capsize, and so vigorously assailing its occupants with their pikes that it was with difficulty any of them were able to swim back to their ship, leaving those of their companions who were not drowned to be butchered by the natives. A saddening history. Of course he did not forget to mention that a French navigator, Surville by name, was the next to visit the shores, and that his visit likewise was the cause of bloodshed and misery. But he gave them a more lengthy and extended narrative of Captain Cook's voyages, which were the most important in their results, as well as the most interesting and tragic in many of their incidents. It was on the 6th of October, 1769, that this navigator first landed on the shores which he visited twice afterwards, and each time added greatly to the stock of previous knowledge concerning these islands, their productions, and their inhabitants. By him it was first ascertained that cannibalism was practiced by some, if not all, of the tribes at that time, and it was very evident, from the manner of Paganel's narration, that hereabout lay the extremely sensitive point of the worthy geographer's fears and forebodings. However, he was not deterred from rehearsing how one and another not merely visited, but began to settle on the island, so that in the Treaty of 1814 it was formally recognized as belonging to Great Britain, and 20 years after was important enough to have a separate official and governmental establishment. Paganel also told, at great length, the tales of many of the sad incidents which from time to time have marked even the commercial intercourse between the European and the Maori, as, for instance, the sad tale of conflict and bloodshed connected with the death of Captain Marion, a French navigator, in 1772. He had landed near the spot where Surville had ill-treated some of the natives and traitorously seized a son of the chief, Thackeray, who yet appeared to welcome this next French visitant, though remembering none the less the terrible duty of vengeance, which is felt by the Maori to be so binding. For a long time the cloak of friendship was worn by the natives, the more thoroughly to lull the suspicions of the whites, and to entice a larger number on shore, in which endeavor they succeeded only too well. The French ships being greatly out of repair, Marion was induced to fell timber at some distance in the interior, and to establish in this occupation a great number of his men, going frequently to them, and remaining with them and the apparently friendly chiefs. It was on the 6th of October, 1769, that this navigator, Captain Cook, first landed on the shores. Safe themselves, the French marksmen picked off the chief. On one of these occasions, the Maoris fulfilled their revengeful project with a terrible satisfaction to themselves. Only one man of all those in the interior managed to escape, the commander himself falling a prey to their vengeance. They then endeavored to kill the second in command, who, with several others, was nearer to the shore. These, of course, at once started for their boats. Breathless, they reached them, hotly pursued to the water's edge by the insatiate savages. Then, safe themselves, the French marksmen picked off the chief, and the previous exultation of the aborigines was, even in the hour of their triumph, turned to lamentation, coupled with wonder at the terrible power of the white man's fire barrel. All this and much more did the geographer narrate, but it must be confessed that he neither spoke, nor did they listen, with the complacency evinced in his previous tales. Besides, their surroundings were at the time uncomfortable, and the first prognostications of a speedy passage were not likely to be verified. Unfortunately, this painful voyage was prolonged. 6 days after her departure, the Macquarie had not descried the shores of Auckland. The wind was fair, however, and still blew from the southwest, but nevertheless the brig did not make much headway. The sea was rough, the rigging creaked, the ribs cracked, and the vessel rode the waves with difficulty. Fortunately, Will Halley, like a man who was in no hurry, did not crowd on sail, or his masts would inevitably have snapped. Captain Mangles hoped, therefore, that this clumsy craft would reach its destination in safety. Still, he was pained to see his companions on board in such miserable quarters. Persistent grief. But neither Lady Helena nor Mary Grant complained, although the continual rain kept them confined, and the want of air and rolling of the ship seriously incommoded them. Their friends sought to divert them, and Paganel strove to while the time with his stories, but did not succeed so well as previously. Of all the passengers, the one most to be pitied was Lord Glenarvan. They rarely saw him below, he could not keep still. His nervous and excitable nature would not submit to an imprisonment between 4 wooden walls. Day and night, heedless of the torrents of rain and the dashing spray of the sea, he remained on deck, sometimes bending over the rail, sometimes pacing up and down with feverish agitation. His eyes gazed continually into space, and during the brief lulls his glass persistently surveyed the horizon. He seemed to question the mute waves, the mist that veiled the sky, the masses of vapor he would have penetrated with a glance. He could not be resigned, and his countenance betokened an acute grief. The power and hopefulness of this man, hitherto so energetic and courageous, had suddenly failed. Captain Mangles seldom left him, but at his side endured the severity of the storm. That day, Glenarvan, wherever there was an opening in the mist, scanned the horizon with the utmost persistency. The young captain approached him. "Is your lordship looking for land?" he asked. Glenarvan shook his head. "It will yet be some time before we leave the brig. We ought to have sighted Auckland Light 36 hours ago." Glenarvan did not answer. He still gazed, and for a moment his glass was pointed towards the horizon to windward of the vessel. "The land is not on that side," said Captain Mangles. "Your lordship should look towards the starboard." "Why, John," replied Glenarvan, It is not the land that I am seeking. What is it, my lord? A courageous captain. Day and night, heedless of the torrents of rain and the dashing spray of the sea, he remained on deck. My yacht, my Duncan. She must be here in these regions, ploughing these seas in that dreadful employment of a pirate. She is here, I tell you, John, on this course between Australia and New Zealand. I have a presentiment that we shall meet her. God preserve us from such a meeting, my lord. Why, John? Your lordship forgets our situation. What could we do on this brig if the Duncan should give us chase? We could not escape. Escape, John? Yes, my lord, we should try in vain. We should be captured at the mercy of the wretches. Ben Joyce has shown that he does not hesitate at a crime. I should sell my life dearly. We would defend ourselves to the last extremity. Well, but then, think of Lady Helena and Mary Grant. Poor women, murmured Glenarvan. John, my heart is broken, and sometimes I feel as if despair had invaded it. It seems to me as if new calamities awaited us, as if heaven had decreed against us. I am afraid. You, my lord. Not for myself, John, but for those whom I love, and whom you love also. Take courage, my lord, replied the young captain. We need no longer fear. The Macquarie is a poor sailor, but still she sails. Well, Halley is a brutish creature, but I am here, and if the approach to the land seems to me dangerous, I shall take the ship to sea again. Therefore from this quarter there is little or no danger. But as for meeting the Duncan, God preserve us and enable us to escape. Captain Mangles was right. To encounter the Duncan would be fatal to the Macquarie, and this misfortune was to be feared in these retired seas, where pirates could roam without danger. However, that day, at least, the Duncan did not appear, and the 6th night since their departure from Twofold Bay arrived without Captain Mangles' fears being realized. But that night was destined to be one of terror. Darkness set in almost instantaneously towards evening. The sky was very threatening. Even Will Halley, whose sense of danger was superior to the brutishness of intoxication, was startled by these warning signs. He left his cabin, rubbing his eyes and shaking his great red head. Then he drew a long breath and examined the masts. The wind was fresh and was blowing strong towards the New Zealand coast. Captain Halley summoned his men with many oaths and ordered them to reef the topsails. Captain Mangles approved in silence. He had given up remonstrating with this coarse seaman, but neither he nor Glenarvan left the deck. 2 hours passed. The sea grew more tempestuous, and the vessel received such severe shocks that it seemed as if her keel were grating on the sand. There was no unusual roughness, but yet this clumsy craft labored heavily, and the deck was deluged by the huge waves. The boat that hung in the larboard davits was swept overboard by a rising billow. Captain Mangles could not help being anxious. Any other vessel would have mocked these surges, but with this heavy hulk they might well fear foundering, for the deck was flooded with every plunge, and the masses of water, not finding sufficient outlet by the scuppers, might submerge the ship. It would have been wise, as a preparation for any emergency, to cut away the waistcloth to facilitate the egress of the water, but Will Halley refused to take this precaution. A nautical coup d'etat. However, a greater danger threatened the Macquarie, and probably there was no longer time to prevent it. About 11:30, Captain Mangles and Wilson, who were standing on the leeward side, were startled by an unusual sound. Their nautical instincts were roused, and the captain seized the sailor's hand. "The surf," said he. "Yes," replied Wilson, "the sea is breaking on the reefs." "Not more than 2 cable lengths distant." "Not more, the shore is here." Captain Mangles leaned over the railing, gazed at the dark waves, and cried, "The sounding lead, Wilson." The skipper, who was in the forecastle, did not seem to suspect his situation. Wilson grasped the sounding line, which lay coiled in its pail, and rushed into the port shrouds. He cast the lead, the rope slipped between his fingers, at the 3rd knot it stopped. 3 fathoms, cried Wilson. "We are on the breakers," shouted the sober captain to the stupefied one. Whether the former saw Halley shrug his shoulders or not is of little consequence. At all events, he rushed towards the wheel and crowded the helm hard alee, while Wilson, letting go the line, hauled upon the topsail yardarms to luff the ship. The sailor who was steering, and had been forcibly pushed aside, did not at all understand this sudden attack. "To the port yards, let loose the sails," cried the young captain, managing so as to escape the reefs.